And good evening. It's March 14th, 2024, and welcome to another one of our branches on the vine with another episode from the folks at Aleph Beta. I'm always interested in patterns, context, and connections, like go figure. And there's always this lingering question, does God speak to us today? And if so, how might that happen? So Rabbi David Fohrman has this connecting, interesting 4-part video series titled, Does God Speak to Us Today? And in these series of videos, we have patterns, context, and connections. Let's take a listen, and then we'll discuss. And welcome this evening to the Dusty Feet. And of course, before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, that's when you click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, so when you click that like button, because it is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. So does God speak to us today? God's little taps on the shoulder. Let's take a listen. See where we connect with this.
Hi everybody, this is Rabbi David Fohrman, and welcome to Parshat Vayechi. You are watching Aleph Beta. This week wraps up a 4-part series. If you haven't seen the last couple weeks' Parsha videos, I recommend you go back and take a look. I just want to come back with you and discuss a couple of the loose ends here in the story of Joseph and Pharaoh's dream, and I also want to talk personally with you in terms of what this might mean for us if any of this theory is in fact true. So first I want to just get one thing out of the way right now, and it is this. In looking back on everything we've said about Pharaoh and Joseph's dream, you need to distinguish between what it is that we hear as a reader of the Torah and what it is that Joseph heard in encountering Pharaoh. The Torah is written in Hebrew. Pharaoh and Joseph probably weren't talking in Hebrew. They were probably talking in Egyptian. The exact language that we see in our text is probably a paraphrase. And if so, you might say, well, if you didn't use the words Yifot Torah, so then it doesn't match up with Rachel, right? The Torah is using these connections to speak to you as a reader. It's a literary device that God is employing in the Torah as a way of communicating to you what it was like for Joseph to listen to these dreams. In other words, the Torah uses the word bor, pit, to describe the prison. It's a literary device that gives you a sense that as Joseph was being pulled out of the prison, there was some sense of deja vu that it just feels like I'm being pulled out of the pit. And as I'm getting these new clothes, it just feels like that moment that the clothes were taken off of me 13 years ago, and now I've been brought to this person. And then later, there's something about the way that Pharaoh's describing these cows that just reminds me of my mother. The Torah is cluing you in, the reader, through the use of these words that help you make the connections. But the connections are going on in Joseph's mind because the events just seem so uncannily similar. What does all of this mean in our own personal lives? Does this ever happen to any of us, that we get these kinds of taps on the shoulder? Like, what would it look like to see these patterns in your own life? And what are the implications of this? Am I supposed to go around in my life searching for these patterns and trying to interpret its meaning? And what if I get it wrong? A while ago, I spent a day in Cleveland, and I was actually just giving this talk about Pharaoh and Joseph's dream to a group of about 16 people, and at the very end of the talk, somebody raised his hand. Have you, Rabbi Fohrman, in your own personal life, ever received any of these taps on the shoulder, the kind of thing you're talking about? And I have to admit, I was kind of taken aback by the question. I wasn't really prepared for it. I said, let me tell you something about my own interest in this topic. It goes back to when I was about 10 or 11 years old. My father was struggling with cancer, and in his struggle with cancer, he was pretty convinced that he had had these kinds of taps on the shoulder a lot. I'll give you an example. He was in remission from cancer for about 2 years. And then one night he had this dream. He saw these two monsters, these like dinosaurs that were battling each other. And in the background of the dream, there were these scenes from places that he had lived, San Francisco, Orinda, and other places. And the last scene was the house in Berkeley, California, where we were living right then. And in that scene, one monster killed the other monster. The last thing he saw was the time, 5:31. And then he woke up and he looked at his watch and it was 5:31 in the morning. And he thought, maybe this dream is telling me something. That this is the last act. That either I'm going to win it or it's going to win me right here. And maybe it's time to go to my doctor and see what's going on. He went to his doctor and found that in fact the cancer was back. And these sort of things happened a lot, these kinds of taps on the shoulder. And I really felt that I needed to talk with someone about it. I mean, maybe my father was just grasping at straws. Maybe he was just kind of desperate. Is there any reality to this? And what does it really mean? I was in 5th grade, so I approached my 5th grade Rabbi and talked with him about it. So I asked him, I said, these dreams, is it really possible? Could there be any meaning in this kind of stuff? And he said to me, dreams don't mean anything. We don't believe in any of this kind of stuff. And he quoted me some suitable Jewish sources to back up the thought. And I went back to my father and said, I was talking to my Rebbe, and he says this is all kind of nonsense, that, God can't speak to people in ways like this. And my father just smiled and said, he's not going through what I'm going through right now. I wouldn't expect him to say anything different. But, I can't deny my experience. This is my experience. And a few years later, my father, Aleph Shalom, died. I guess it had always been something that preoccupied me. I mean, was this real? Was my father, grasping at straws because he was desperate and wanted to see something when really nothing was there? I always felt it was an unresolved issue for me. Were these taps on the shoulder real? Could they be real? And then I concluded to my audience in Cleveland, I said, I guess that kind of explains my interest in the subject. And it was why it was personally meaningful to me to find, after all of these years, this Joseph story, in which the Torah seems to be saying that, yeah, God can talk non-prophetically to you. These kinds of taps on the shoulder could be real. And then I left, and I went in the car to my last talk of the day. And as I got into the car, it struck me that I had actually evaded this fellow's question. He asked me, do you feel these taps in your own life? And I hadn't talked about my own life. I talked about my father's life. I wonder why it was that I had done that. Why did I evade his question? Was it because I was too embarrassed to admit that I didn't really feel any of these kinds of taps on the shoulder in my own life? Whatever the case was, I was off to my next talk, and my next talk wasn't in front of 16 people, it was in front of 300 people, and I was late. I was supposed to talk about something else, but I was too exhausted. I figured, let me talk about Joseph and Pharaoh's dream again. Anyway, so I'm getting into the hall, I'm late, I'm trying to get my computer to hook up to the projector because my PowerPoint isn't showing. Everyone's waiting for the talk to begin, and in these kind of situations, there's always somebody there, hey, Rabbi Fohrman, do you remember me? And so there's this guy who says this, and I'm thinking, no, just leave me alone. But he says it again, hey, Rabbi Fohrman, do you remember me? And I look at him, and I say, 1 second, I do remember you. You're my 5th grade Rabbi from Berkeley, California. It was 25 years later. I hadn't seen this man in ages, and there he is. After I gave the talk, an hour later, I sat down and I said, here you were, evading questions about taps on the shoulder. And it's almost like God saying to you, why? Because you think you haven't had enough taps lately? So I'll give you a tap on the shoulder. The guy who says there's no such thing as taps, he's going to be the one to tap you on the shoulder. What does it mean? What's the grand significance of that moment in my life? I don't know. But even if I don't understand the meaning of that, the fact that I felt that just couldn't deny that God was right there in my life, that means something to me. If you ask somebody, do you have a sense in your everyday life that God is right there with you? I think most of us, if we had to answer honestly to that question, we no. I go about my everyday life, carpools, this and that. And I think part of the reason why we feel that way is because when we think about God, it's like God has so many better things to do than worry about little old me. I mean, who am I? I'm one person in a city of 1 million people in a galaxy with 100 billion stars, who knows how many planets. And God's got to take care of the whole thing. And I'm just such a small little piece. You really think that the master of the universe is going to be taking his time walking with me in my life? It seems so remote. But what would happen if at least one moment in your life you knew that it was true? God really was walking with you. The evidence was just stacking up. It just seemed too remote a coincidence. It's like there was God. It seems to be that can be a life-changing moment. If I mattered in that moment, then the theory that I don't count because I'm too small just doesn't hold water anymore. Maybe God's always walking with me, but that's just the moment I happen to glimpse it to be true. A life in which you feel accompanied is very different than a life in which you feel all alone. And now I just want to conclude this series with you by considering the other side of the coin here. I think that these taps on the shoulder are significant insofar as they suggest to us God's presence in our lives, but not necessarily significant insofar as they demand from us a kind of interpretation, because that effort to interpret, especially when not all of the facts are on the table, can be very, very dangerous and can lead you into great trouble. And for this, I want to come back with you one last time to the Joseph and Pharaoh story. Pharaoh had two dreams, not just one. All of the resonances that we've seen that take Joseph back to his own life, those are all in the dream about the 7 beautiful cows and the 7 ugly cows. But he has another dream that we haven't treated at all, that there's none of these resonances in, and that's the dream with the 7 sheaves of wheat, the 7 beautiful sheaves and the 7 ugly sheaves. Why does Pharaoh have 2 dreams? Why does only one of them resonate with Joseph's life? So I want to share with you a fascinating theory developed by my friend Jonathan Grossman. Jonathan remarked to me, he said, if you were Pharaoh and you were going to have a dream that was going to talk to you about the gross domestic product of Egypt, would it be more logical to express that in terms of sheaves of wheat or in terms of cows? Egypt was an agrarian society. The Nile overflowed each year. It was the only place in the arid Middle East where you could reliably plant crops. They ate wheat. They didn't eat cows. So the dream about cows would have been a strange dream for Pharaoh to have. And now remember, it was the dream about cows that had all the resonances with Joseph's own life. Perhaps that would have confirmed to Joseph, looking at that dream, one second. When Pharaoh was dreaming about sheaves of wheat, he was dreaming about him. But the cows? I'm the cattle rancher around him. My family was involved with herds and cattle. And in that dream, there's all these resonances to my own life. The dream about the cows, that was a dream about me. That dream about me provided a key so that I could help interpret the dream about him. But then if that's true, Joseph must look back on his own life and said, one second, when I was 17 years old, I also had 2 dreams. Now, one of those dreams was about the sun and the moon and the 11 stars, but I had another dream about sheaves of wheat. I had all these sheaves of wheat. My brothers had sheaves of wheat, and their sheaves were bowing down to my sheaves. What was I doing dreaming about wheat? I'm a cattle rancher. I'm not a wheat farmer. Pharaoh's the wheat farmer. And then, perhaps, that led Joseph straight to the following conclusion. One second. When Pharaoh was dreaming about cows, he was dreaming about my past, right? Maybe when I was dreaming about wheat, I was dreaming about Pharaoh's future. It never meant that I was supposed to rule over my brothers back then when I was 17 years old. It was talking about the future. One day, my brothers would be desperate, and I would be in charge of all the wheat. They would come bowing to me, desperate for food. But then I also had another dream too, a dream whose meaning seemed so self-evident. The sun, the moon, and the 11 stars would all come bowing to me. We all thought we knew what that meant. The sun, my father, the moon, my mother, the 11 stars, obviously my brothers, they're all going to come bowing to me. But maybe we were all wrong. Maybe the self-evident dream wasn't so self-evident, because what did Pharaoh's dream teach me? That things don't always represent things like cows. They can represent time, and the units of time they can represent are years. What if I take that lesson and apply it now to my own dream? How many heavenly bodies were there in my dream? The sun and the moon and the 11 stars, that's 13. How old was I when I had that dream? I was 17 years old. The text tells us that Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. Both dreams mean the same thing. In 13 years, the entire universe is going to come bowing to you. You're going to be in charge of all the wheat in the world. It took Pharaoh's dream 13 years later to be able to have the key to understand in retrospect what Joseph's own dreams really meant. In the end, Joseph and his whole family made an error. They were correct that Joseph's dreams weren't coincidence, that they were a product of the divine, but then they made a leap when they didn't really have all the facts. And that leap is so tempting. If God is talking to me, why is he talking to me? Clearly, to communicate a message, I have to understand the message. And if I don't have all the facts, let's see, what do I think the message is? That's a dangerous game to play. You don't always know what it means. Yes, in retrospect, later, sometimes you figure it out. Sometimes you never do. Sometimes all you know is that you got a tap on the shoulder. And that's okay. And you have to have the humility to say, I don't understand. But what I do know is that I'm not alone. And because of that, my life is profoundly different.
I really did enjoy how the Rabbi started this video, right? Thinking about determining when we hear as readers of the Torah, right? And what Joseph experienced in the moment that he was living, right? We do this often in Scripture. I find it interesting because I do know that when we read it, or when we hear it, I think we might think of it as like a movie script, that this is what was actually said, right? These are the actual words. These are quotes. And yet, if we stop, and I mean really honestly look at it, they're not. So I think often really, we need to remember that these are captured moments. These are remembered events. These are events that are shared down the road. These are events that have happened and that are now looked back upon, and these people are gleaning what's happened, what's going on in the story, what they're trying to tell us, and what they want us to remember, right? Because it's just not about the Joseph story. This isn't all of Scripture. This is in everything in Scripture. These even include those words that Jesus spoke, those red letter parts. This includes all of that. They're not literal word for word written down scribed pieces. But you know what? That actually does help us, because the storyteller is intentionally sharing these events and the stories that they put together to get us to connect things, to grab things together, to connect them to Tanakh, right? The Old Testament. That really helps us grasp particular points, especially when we see them in some different gospel iterations, or hear a quote back from the references from something that Peter or Paul wrote, right? Any of those, the letters, yeah? Any of those. Because sometimes we see they don't match. The words don't match. And sometimes I guess we can get worked up over it, right? Because why don't they match? But we're looking around, we're seeing these things, and then we realize they were never designed that way. This is how the authors are telling the story and what they're sharing by either what they heard, what they understood, or what they've been told. For us to understand the story that they were told. For instance, Luke, he didn't witness anything, right? He wasn't following Jesus. So everything that he shares are from others being there. And he stitched their stories together. So those red letters in Luke, they're not recordings. They're shared stories for us. Or to be honest, really, to Theophilus, right? Because he wanted him to understand. So that said, with the account that we're keeping, I really appreciate the Rabbi for bringing this part out, right? The difference between what's happening in the moment and what we're hearing, what we're reading as these consumers of any part of the Bible, okay? These connected moments. This is what the Rabbi's talking about. So the Rabbi asks a fair question, and I think it's a good one. How does this, or how can this come to us today, right? That's one of my dad's favorite phrases, right? How does this affect us today? One of the things he talks about is, can we see this? Do we get these moments? The Rabbi coined the phrase, taps on the shoulder. I like it. So he brings up, where do we see these? Because if they're here, and when they're here, or looking back on all the different connections, if we see them, what do we do? So that leads into that personal story of the Rabbi's own life and the life of his father. So the Rabbi opens with it getting a question, a very personal question, right? From a talk he was giving. Have you ever had one of these moments of God tapping you on the shoulder? It was interesting to hear him, to talk about it, and that the initial response was to evade the answer. But then he does share that very personal story of his going back in his own childhood to his dad struggling with cancer. That's very real. It's very personal. It's a painful story, I would suspect. So the Rabbi shares of the dream that his father had, because his father believed that he'd had these taps on the shoulder. So he shares a dream that his father had when he was in remission for a couple of years, and then this dream prompted him to go to the doctor. The doctor tells him that the cancer is back with a vengeance. So the Rabbi, even as a child, does what any child would do, right? He'd go and seek the guidance of an adult, especially a teacher. So he goes to his 5th grade Rabbi, yeah? He asks, Rabbi, does this happen today? And the Rebbe says, no, not today. Then he quotes some suitable Jewish sources. But when he came back and he goes to his dad, his father's response, that hit me. Well, he's not going through what I'm going through right now, but I wouldn't expect him to say anything different. But I can't deny my experience. This is what's happening to me. You know, his father was not upset that his son went to the Rabbi and he came back with a different answer from his. He didn't tell his son the Rabbi was full of it. You need to listen to me. He said, I understand. I just can't deny what I've experienced. And a few years later, his father dies. Baruch Hashem. And the thoughts wandered around the rabbi's mind. Was his father just grasping at straws, trying to deal with it all? Yeah. So this was an unresolved question for me, the rabbi is saying. Do these taps on the shoulders happen? Is this real? So this does explain a bit of his interest in this part of the Joseph story, and to see that God can speak to us in non-prophetic ways. But again, back to that question diverted in the first talk. Have those happened in your own life? Because this became a real question to the rabbi, one that resurfaced from his childhood. The rabbi goes to his next talk, and there in the audience is that 5th grade Rebbe. He said to him, do you remember me? Rabbi ignored him. He said, do you remember me? And it hits him. All those memories come flooding back. Then the rabbi brings up the question, do you believe that the average person is cognizant of this presence of God in their everyday lives? I'm not sure about most of you, but I'll be honest, I put my hand up and say, no, I'm not sure that we're cognizant of this every day. Yet I can say that I have had those tap on the shoulder moments. Times when I've stopped, and you look back and you go, that's that tap on the shoulder connection. Connections with people, places, situations. You find yourself in all of these and you stop for a moment and you say, oh, that's why I'm here. Or maybe that's why I was delayed so I could be here. Or that's why I got diverted so I could be here. I guess there are those that could just chalk that up to coincidence. Just the fact that those things, they just happen. And I'll bite. You can choose to think that way. But I choose to think differently. Because I'm fine with taps on the shoulder. Because I think taps on the shoulder tell us a lot. It's interesting, though, if you think about it, that tap on the shoulder, that can go both ways. Meaning encouragement, or are you sure you want to be here? Or are you sure you should be here? I think one of the other points that I enjoyed about the rabbi's story is that if you have these tap on the shoulder moments, it means that you matter. It means that you mattered to God. That's important, I think, and it's one of the reasons why I choose to feel those taps on the shoulder. Because I believe that I do matter to God. And these moments just helps reinforce that. A life in which you feel accompanied by God, and not a life that you feel alone, especially alone without God. I know what's also important, though, was the final point that he brought up about those taps on the shoulder. Because they're important for us to show God's involvement in our lives. However, we need to be careful because that doesn't mean that they are events. And we try for interpretation. Especially interpretation that drives other people's behaviors and other people's decisions. That effort to interpret, to seek meaning, does have its cautionary tale. Because possibly, again, like in the Joseph story, you just don't have all the pieces of the puzzle. Because we know with Joseph, he could not have understood the first 2 dreams without having the next 13 years. Arguably even longer. The dreams, both sets of dreams needed to be realized together to make it all a cohesive story. You know, I was reminded that it doesn't say that God came to them in a dream. It just says they had a dream. I've heard people say that they've had dreams and then they come and they tell you what it means. And then I've looked back and so far, I haven't seen evidence of anything of that happening. So it continues to be a cautionary tale for me. But it's something for me personally that I'm careful of, that I'm aware that those are there, but that these taps on the shoulder, they are real. And that I, like the rabbi, I still choose to be cautionary. Because do I have all the information to fully understand why these are happening? Not sure, so it's a real thought for me. But I do know that if it is a tap on the shoulder, that it means I'm not alone. So this wraps up our series with Rabbi Fohrman, Does God Speak to Us Today? And it really has been an insightful look in the life of Joseph and again, these bit of personal experiences that hopefully can help us along the way. So thank you for being with us tonight on another one of the branches on the vine with Aleph Beta on the Dusty Feet.